Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind howled through the wooden slats of the Evanston Station platform as Calla Jennings stepped off the Union Pacific train, her gloved hand clutching a worn carpetbag and her heart pounding like a hammer in her chest. She had come all this way from Missouri, her entire life packed into one bag, and one promise: a marriage proposal from a man named Walter Griggs, a rancher who had answered her mail-order bride letter with words full of stability and kindness. He had sent for her in spring. Now it was August. Dust clung to her hem and to the air, and the platform was quiet except for the hiss of steam and the clack of her boots on the planks. But there was no Walter Griggs. Not a soul stood with a sign. No man with a hat tilted back and a hopeful smile. Just a telegraph operator locking up for the night and a few townsfolk hauling crates of goods into wagons. Calla stood there until the sun dipped behind the hills, until the last train whistle echoed off the rocks, until her knees trembled beneath the weight of shame and fear. He was not coming. She sat down on a bench and folded her hands in her lap, stubbornly holding her head high though her face burned. Her throat ached. She had no money for a return ticket, no family left to write to. All she had was the letter from Walter, now crumpled in her pocket and worth less than the paper it was written on. "Ma'am." The voice came from the station master, an older man with a kindly face. "You need somewhere to stay tonight? The boarding house is just up the road." Calla nodded once, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you." She walked through town with her shoulders squared, but her eyes darted from face to face, hoping foolishly, desperately, that someone would call her name. No one did. 10 miles south, beneath the black sweep of a star-soaked sky, Cooper Callahan's boots hit the dirt hard as he threw his saddle over his Mustang and tightened the cinch faster than his thoughts could settle. "She was on the train?" he asked again, voice low and sharp. "Got in at 7, the stable boy said, holding a lantern. "No one was there for her." Cooper cursed under his breath and swung into the saddle. "She came all that way. Griggs left her sittin' there like a sack of oats." The boy nodded. "He took off 2 days ago. Sold his place. Word is he's headed to California." Cooper's jaw tightened. "She came to marry him. Guess she is not anymore." Cooper turned the Mustang toward the north road. "Keep the lantern. I will ride through the night." "You do not even know her," the boy called after him. But that was not true. Cooper did know her, at least he remembered her. A girl from the river town in Missouri, Calla Jennings. She had been 17 the last time he saw her, standing on the porch of her father's dry goods store, handing out penny candy to the local boys who swarmed like bees. She had not noticed Cooper back then. He was just a ranch hand passing through. But he had never forgotten the way she smiled, bright and quick, like she still believed in good things. He rode hard through the dark, the Mustang's hoofs pounding the packed dirt road as the stars wheeled above. His coat snapped in the wind, the saddle jostling under him with every mile. He did not stop, not when the moon dipped low, not when the cold bit through his gloves. He just kept riding. Calla lay on the stiff boarding house bed, staring at the ceiling, her hands curled into fists on top of the quilt. She had not cried, not once, but she felt the tears waiting, pressing at the back of her throat like something sharp. Alone, abandoned and humiliated. She had risked everything, and now she was nothing but a story for the gossiping mouths in town. A soft knock came at the door just past dawn. She opened it slowly, expecting the landlady or worse, another stranger with pity in their eyes. Instead, a tall man stood there, covered in dust, his eyes a stormy gray and his hat held in his hands. "Miss Jennings." His voice was rough from the night. She blinked, confused. "Yes. My name is Cooper Callahan. I rode through the night to find you." Calla stepped back, heart hammering. "Why?" "Walter Griggs. He left. I know you came here for him, but he is gone." I figured you ought to hear it from someone who respects you enough to say it to your face." She looked at him, his boots scuffed, his face shadowed by fatigue, and something about him settled the ache in her chest. "I remember you," she said quietly. "You worked for the McDougalls years ago. I used to give your little brother licorice sticks." Cooper's lips twitched. He remembers that. Still talks about it. Calla's shoulders dropped. She leaned against the doorframe. "So, what now?" He hesitated. "You do not have to stay here. Not alone." She raised an eyebrow. "And where would I go?" "To my ranch. I got a spare room. You need a place while you figure things out. No catch. Just kindness." Calla searched his face, her pride shouting no but her heart whispering yes. She saw no false promise in his eyes, just something steady, solid. "I will pack my bag," she said. They rode side by side on his wagon, the town falling away behind them. The sky grew wide and gold as the sun crept up the horizon. Neither of them spoke much, but it was not an awkward silence. It was the kind that let two people breathe at the same rhythm. Cooper pointed out the river bend where he fished, the old pine tree that had been struck by lightning last spring, the hills where the cattle grazed. Calla listened. She wrapped her shawl tighter and let the wind pull her thoughts forward instead of back. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high and warm, and two young children came running from the barn barefoot and grinning. "Harriet! Henry!" Cooper called out, pulling the reins. The girl looked about 9, the boy maybe 6. They froze when they saw Calla, wide-eyed and curious. "These are my niece and nephew," Cooper said, hopping down. "My sister passed 3 years ago. I have been raising them since." Calla stepped down and smiled gently. "Hello." Harriet inched closer. "Are you the lady from the train?" Calla nodded. "I guess I am." Henry looked up at Cooper. "Is she staying?" Cooper glanced at Calla. "That is up to her." Calla looked out at the land-rolling hills, a red barn, and a house with a porch that looked like it had stories to tell. Then she looked at Cooper, standing there with dust on his boots and something honest in his eyes. "I think I will stay a while." The morning air smelled of sage and warm dust as Calla followed Cooper through the ranch house. The floorboards creaked beneath her shoes, and sunlight filtered in through simple muslin curtains, casting soft lines across the worn plank floors. The house wasn't large, but each room had the look of something carefully kept. No frills, no wasted space, just clean surfaces, a few hand-sewn quilts, and a wood stove that still radiated the heat from breakfast. Cooper led her down a narrow hallway and opened a door. "This was my sister's sewing room. Cleared it out last winter. Figured I'd use it for storage, but it's yours now if you want it." The room was small, but the window faced east, and the light was kind. A narrow bed stood against the wall, a washbasin sat on a table near the door, and a single pine chair waited beside the window. There was no mirror. Calla set her carpetbag down gently. "It'll do just fine." She looked over at him. "Thank you." He gave a slight nod and rubbed the back of his neck. "I've got chores." "You don't need to do anything unless you want to." "I'd rather not sit idle." He hesitated, then gestured toward the doorway. "Come on. We'll start with the goats." They crossed the yard, the sun already warming the earth. The barn doors stood open, the air inside thick with hay and the soft rustle of animals moving in their pens. Harriet was perched on an overturned bucket, brushing a shaggy gray goat with uncommon focus. Henry crouched nearby, attempting to coax a chicken out from under a feed bin with a piece of biscuit. Calla watched the children for a moment before stepping onto the straw-covered floor. "You let them help with ranch work?" Cooper reached for a feed sack. "They've been helping since they could walk. Not always useful, but they're trying." Harriet looked up. "I'm very useful," she said, without looking away from the goat. Calla crouched beside her. "What's his name?" "Pinecone," Harriet said. "Because he's lumpy." Calla smothered a laugh. "It suits him." Cooper poured feed into a trough. "If you want, you can help me mend fence this afternoon. I've got a section near the north pasture that keeps sagging." "I can handle that," Calla said, brushing hay from her skirt. "I've done worse." He paused long enough to glance at her. "What kind of work did you do before?" "My father's store kept me busy most days. After he passed, I took in sewing and helped out in the schoolhouse when the teacher fell ill." He nodded. "So you're not afraid of work." "I wouldn't have made it this far if I was." They shared a look, brief but steady. Later, they rode out together, a pair of tools rattling in the back of the wagon and 2 canteens slung beneath the seat. The road narrowed as it climbed a rise, the land spreading wide on either side, dotted with cottonwoods and the occasional fence post leaning like an old man in the wind. When they reached the broken stretch, Cooper handed her a pair of gloves and pointed to the wire. "Top strands loose. Post might be rotted through." Calla took the gloves and crouched beside the fence. Her fingers worked the wire with practiced care, the metal biting through the leather. Cooper watched her a moment, then set to replacing the post. They didn't talk much, just the scrape of tools, the rustle of wind through the grass, and the distant lowing of cattle. After a while, Calla straightened and wiped her brow. "You always do all this alone?" "I've had help from neighbors now and then. Mostly I manage." "What about the children? Don't they need more than just chores and quiet?" "I give them what I can." He paused, leaning on the shovel. "I know it's not everything. I try." Calla looked out across the pasture, the grass rolling like waves. "They're good children. You must be doing something right." He didn't answer, but his jaw eased slightly. That evening, back at the house, Calla helped Harriet peel potatoes while Henry sat on the floor carving a piece of softwood into what might have been a horse. Cooper stepped in from outside smelling of smoke and earth, and for a moment, the room felt like it had always been lived in with her there. "Over supper?" Harriet asked. "Are you going to stay forever?" Calla glanced at Cooper before replying. "That depends." "On what?" Henry asked. She smiled gently. "On whether I'm needed." Cooper took a sip of coffee and didn't look up. "You are," he said, quiet but sure. She didn't answer right away. Just let the warmth of the fire and the weight of the day settle into her bones. Later, after the dishes were washed and the children tucked in, she stood on the porch with her arms folded, watching the stars come out one by one. Cooper joined her, the door easing shut behind him. "They like you," he said after a minute. "It's easy when they're kind." He leaned against the post. "You could stay longer than a while." She turned to look at him. "Is that an offer?" "It's an invitation," he said. "No expectations. But there's room here for someone like you." She held his gaze, her voice quiet. "I'll stay then, at least until the frost comes." He nodded slowly. "That's long enough to see what might come of it." And between them, something unspoken settled like a seed not yet sprouted, but planted in good earth. The wind shifted as September settled into the valley, bringing with it the brittle scent of dry grass and the slow hush of summer, giving way to something quieter. Mornings came with a chill now, and Calla woke earlier, drawn by the rhythm of the ranch and the comfort of a life that asked something of her hands. She had begun to rise just before first light, pulling on her boots while the house still slept. Not out of obligation, but out of something steadier, belonging, perhaps, though she hadn't said it aloud. She'd started baking bread twice a week, and Cooper never said anything, but he left flour and lard on the table without asking. That was how they spoke, most days, through actions instead of declarations. On a Tuesday, after the sun had crested the ridge and the children were gathering eggs, Cooper found her near the garden, sleeves rolled and a hoe in her grip. She paused only when his shadow fell across the soil. "I've been thinking about expanding the pen behind the barn," he said. "Might take on 2 more milk cows come spring." She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "You'll need fencing. And help." He nodded once. "That's what I wanted to ask you. Not just for the work." His eyes didn't shift away. "For the decisions, too." Calla leaned on the hoe handle. "You mean to have me help run the place?" "I mean to have you help shape it." She studied him a long moment. "You trust me with that?" "I do." They didn't say more, but later that day, he brought home lumber, and they marked out the new fence line together, measuring by strides and the width of their joined hands. That evening, as the children played on the porch with a pair of makeshift dolls stitched from flour sacks, Calla sat beside Cooper on the steps, her skirt brushing the edge of his knee. The sky was streaked with rose and copper, and the quiet between them wasn't empty. "I found a letter in my bag," she said at last, her voice low. "From my aunt back east. I hadn't seen it before. She wrote to say her health's failing. Wants me to come care for her." Cooper's jaw tightened. "Will you go?" "I'm not sure." She looked out at the pasture, the fence line they'd begun just hours before. "I thought I'd feel pulled, but I don't." He didn't answer right away. Then, "You don't owe her your life. I know that, and I know she doesn't owe me hers." He turned toward her. "Then maybe you stay where you're needed, where you're wanted." She didn't look at him, not yet. "That's the part I'm still learning to believe." The next morning, she found a wooden box on the kitchen table. Inside was a set of carving tools well used, but clean and oiled. Beneath them, a small note written in a hand she recognized from the ledger he kept by the stove. "For when you want to make something your own." She didn't speak of it, but she began whittling scraps of pine in the evenings, her fingers learning the grain, the weight, the quiet satisfaction of shaping something that hadn't existed before. 3 days later, Cooper rode into town for supplies. He returned with a bolt of calico and a packet of needles wrapped in brown paper. When Calla unwrapped them, she blinked once and said, "You remembered." He nodded, setting down his hat. "You said the ones you brought were dull. Figured you shouldn't have to work twice as hard to mend a shirt." Their closeness grew in the space between gestures like these, never rushed, never spoken of directly. But it was there in the way she refilled his coffee before he asked, in the way he brought her a blanket when the wind picked up at dusk. One night, as clouds rolled over the moon and rain whispered against the roof, Calla sat by the fire, darning one of Harriet's stockings. Cooper came in, boots damp, shoulders heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. He stood for a moment near the hearth, watching the flames. Then, without turning, he said, "I used to think I'd never have a home that didn't feel half empty." Calla didn't look up from her stitching. "And now, I think it only took the right person walking through the door." She pressed her thumb to the thread, her breath catching just slightly. "You think she's staying?" "I hope she is. I don't have much to offer, Calla, but whatever I've got, it's yours, if you want it." She set the stocking aside and stood, facing him fully. "I didn't come here for riches, Cooper. I came looking for a place to be enough." He stepped forward, slowly, as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. "You've been enough since the day you stepped off that train." And when she reached for his hand, rough and warm from the work of the day, he held it like something sacred, not with urgency, but with certainty. In the hush between thunder and the next drop of rain, she leaned into him. Not because she had to, but because it was where she wanted to be. And though no promises were spoken that night, something lasting had already taken root. Not in words, but in the way his hand stayed in hers long after the fire burned low. By mid-October, frost clung to the porch rails come morning, and the cottonwoods behind the barn stood nearly bare. their last yellow leaves skittering across the yard like paper ghosts. The days shortened, and the land turned quiet in that way it always did before winter, like it was drawing breath, holding still. Calla stood at the kitchen table. Sleeves rolled as she pressed dough into a tin, the scent of lard and molasses rising warm into the room. Cooper had taken the wagon east to check on a neighbor's mare with a twisted leg, and she found the quiet of the house settling around her without unease. Harriet hummed near the hearth while untangling a skein of yarn, and Henry lay on his belly, tracing the grain of the floor with a charcoal stub. "Miss Calla," Harriet said without looking up, "do you know how to make sugar candy?" "I do," Calla replied, brushing flour from her hands. "But it needs a steady fire and a clear day. The weather's turned too sharp for it." The girl nodded, disappointment flickering only briefly before she returned to her yarn. From the window above the sink, Calla caught sight of Cooper's figure out by the southern fence line just returning. Reins loose in one hand, the other steadying something bundled across the wagon seat. She stepped out onto the porch as he approached, wool shawl drawn close. "You weren't supposed to be back till dusk," she said as he climbed down. "Didn't take long," he answered. "She'll mend fine. Just needed splinting and rest." He glanced toward the covered shape beside him. "Brought something else, too?" Calla stepped closer as he pulled back the canvas. Beneath it sat a small iron stove, its sides rusted but sound. "Mrs. Dobbins from the Creek homestead lost her husband last winter. She's giving up the place. Said this was too heavy to haul." Calla ran her hand along the stove's edge. "It's still good. I figured you could use it in the sewing room." "You've been working with cold fingers." Her hand stilled. "You noticed that?" "I notice plenty," he said, eyes steady on hers. She looked away only long enough to swallow. "I'll make it last." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and Cooper sat reading beside the fire, Calla brought out her cedar box and opened it beside his chair. Inside lay the carved animals she'd been shaping in recent weeks: a bear, a pair of birds, a running dog mid-stride, each one small, detailed, smooth from her careful hands. "I thought they might make good gifts," she said. "For the children. For Christmas." Cooper set down the worn almanac and lifted one of the birds. "You made these?" She nodded. "They look real enough to fly. I wanted to give them something that lasts." He turned the bird over gently in his palm. "You've already given them that." The silence that followed wasn't uneasy, it was something fuller, like the space between sentences when the meaning's already known. Cooper rose, setting the carving back with the others. "I've been thinking on something," he said, his voice low. "Been thinking on it for weeks." Calla's fingers tightened around the box lid. "Say it plain. I want you to stay. Not just through the winter. Not just in that back room. I want you beside me proper." She didn't speak right away. Then, "You mean to marry me?" "I do." She stepped back only slightly, her breath visible in the cold air between them. "You're not offering out of kindness?" "No," he said simply. "I'm offering because I want to share the rest of my days with you, because the house feels full when you're in it, because the children sleep easier knowing you're near, and because I've waited a long time to feel something that doesn't carry weight like regret." Calla looked at him, then not with surprise, but with a calm that came from having already known, deep down, what he felt. "I didn't come here looking for love," she said, "but I found it all the same." He reached for her hand, warm and sure between his. They stood like that a while, the fire crackling low, the house around them still. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but inside there was only peace, the kind built not on grand promises, but on shared mornings, small kindnesses, and the quiet certainty of choosing one another day after day. And when Cooper leaned in and kissed her, it wasn't the beginning of something, but the confirmation of what had already begun. The first snow came early, settling in a soft hush across the pasture as November turned the land pale and still. Cooper's ranch quieted to its winter rhythm with stacked higher by the porch, livestock sheltered closer to the barn, and the children's boots lined with rags against the creeping cold. Inside, the rooms smelled of pine resin and wool. Calla sat by the window in the sewing room, hers now in truth hemming Harriet's new Sunday dress by lamplight. Outside, the wind moved the bare limbs of the cottonwoods, and the stove Cooper had brought her ticked as it warmed. She paused, needle poised, and listened to the faint sounds of Cooper and Henry in the loft above the barn, hammering down loose boards before the next storm. There'd been no ceremony yet, but the promise between them needed no witness. Still, the town preacher had paid a visit the week before, and Cooper had spoken to him plainly. "We'll wed before winter closes the roads," he'd said, and Calla, standing beside him, had nodded once, her hand resting lightly on the small of his back. Now, with snow drifting outside and the hour nearing supper, Cooper pushed open the front door, his coat powdered white at the shoulders and his cheeks ruddy from the wind. "You've been gone near the whole afternoon," Calla said as he stamped off the snow and hung his coat by the stove. "Had to ride out past the creek bend. That heifer calved early." He set a small burlap sack on the table. "Stopped by the Andertons on the way back. Left them a sack of oats and brought home something for you." Calla opened the sack and drew out a spool of deep blue thread, smoother than any she'd used since Missouri. Her breath caught a little. "They had it stored away," he said. "Didn't think anyone would want it." "I do," she said, fingers brushing the thread's edge. "I'll use it for the dress." "You making yourself one?" "No," she looked at him. "For our wedding." Cooper didn't speak, but the warmth in his eyes said more than words could. The next morning, with Harriet and Henry off helping the neighbors' children gather kindling, Calla stepped into the barn with a pail of warm mash and found Cooper brushing the mare's flank, his sleeves rolled back and his shirt damp at the collar. "I've been thinking," she said, setting the pail down, "about that plot behind the orchard." "What about it?" "You said it was too rocky for planting. Too shallow for roots." "Well, I'd like to build something there. A small cabin. Just one room, wide window. For sewing. For teaching, maybe." He leaned the brush against the stall and looked at her. "You want your own space. I want a space that adds something. I could take on the girls from the valley come spring. Teach them to stitch, mend, make things last. Their mothers work hard. They don't have time to teach everything." His mouth curved, not in amusement but admiration. "You think of things I never would. That's why we make a good pair." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're not just part of this place, Calla. You've made it whole." The wedding was held 2 weeks later in the parlor, with fresh pine boughs hung from the rafters and Harriet holding a small bouquet of dried yarrow and sage. Henry wore a brushed coat too large for his shoulders and stood beside Cooper with solemn pride. The preacher read from his worn book while snow fell soft outside, covering the world in quiet. Cooper's hands were calloused against hers, and when he spoke his vows, voice low and steady, she felt every word settle into her like the warmth of fire through wool. "I'll stand beside you," he said. "In harvest and drought, in silence and storm. What I have, I give. What I know, I share. I'll keep you warm in the cold and steady in the wind." Calla, with her hair pinned simply and her dress stitched with her own hands, met his eyes without fear. "I'll walk with you," she said, "through every season this land gives us. I'll mend what breaks, hold what's needed, and love you without condition." They kissed to the scent of wood smoke and pine, and the room, small as it was, held the weight of something larger than the walls themselves. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had burned low, Cooper and Calla sat curled together beneath a quilt she'd pieced from scraps of old shirts and flour sacks. Her head rested against his chest, and his hand moved slow along her back. "You ever think," she murmured, "how far off course we had to go to get here?" "I don't reckon it was off course," he said. "Just winding. I'm glad it wound this way." "So am I." They fell asleep that way, the kind of sleep that only comes after long travel and long waiting, with no more distance between them. Spring came slow and wet. The children grew taller. The sewing cabin rose behind the orchard, built with Cooper's hands and Calla's plans. By midsummer, 3 girls from nearby homesteads came twice a week to learn with needle and thread, and their laughter spilled through the windows like birdsong. Cooper built a bench beneath the cottonwoods, and most evenings he and Calla sat there, watching the sky change, her hand resting over his, fingers laced. The ranch held no grandeur, but it held them, and that was enough. Calla never wrote back to her aunt, not because she was cruel, but because she didn't need to explain anymore. She had chosen her life, and it had chosen her back. Every morning, Cooper kissed her before heading to the fields, and every night, he returned to her face in the doorway, the lamplight catching the gold in her eyes. And so they lived together in work, in quiet joy, in the kind of love that doesn't rise loud but stays, steady as the land beneath their feet.